Hi everyone, I'm Sarah from Sourdough for Beginners. I'm glad you're here. If this is your first time seeing me, then please make sure that you subscribe, follow, all that good stuff. It helps my content get out there. So if you have been following me for a while, then you know that I teach sourdough. I am always focused on the beginner. So my style is to figure out what's difficult, try to make it easier, try to simplify things. So this year I've started a new series. There we go. There's the word. It's always good when it's live. I've started a new series called Everything I've Learned About Sourdough. And what I'm doing is, as I'm going through and I'm working with my sourdough, I'm paying attention to the things that are difficult or challenging when it comes to sourdough. So a few days ago, I did Everything I've Learned About Starter. You can find that on my Facebook page. There's also a playlist on the YouTube channel, the Sourdough for Beginners YouTube channel, called Everything I've Learned. So if you want a comprehensive, sort of overview of everything about starters, from what kind of container you're going to use to what kind of flour you're going to use to how you're going to develop it and how you're going to maintain it after, then you can find that there. Today, I'm going to cover everything I've learned about mix-ins. So I had a little bit of a mix-in adventure over the last few days. And this one was challenging because there was lots of things going on. So I thought, since I've got this loaf here, which by the way, it tastes pretty good, but it's a little dense, it's a little bit off. I thought this would be a great opportunity to show some of the considerations that you would take when you're adding mix-ins. So in the group, on the page, all the time, we always see people asking questions about what mix-ins should I use, when should I add them, how do I do it, why is it that I can bake perfect bread all the time, but every time I add to some cheese and jalapeno, the bread acts completely differently, right? So I think that we should look at sort of the different ways to add mix-ins and what those considerations are and the factors to consider. So for the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'm just going to cover this. If you've got any questions as we go, post them in the comments. I'll try and catch them as they go by, but I do always check the comments afterwards. In the comments, there's a link to my link tree. So that's got all of our tutorials. That's got the Facebook page, the YouTube channel. It's got the beginner bread recipe, the level 2 hydration recipe. It's got links to discounts for products that are related to sourdough, all of that stuff. So you'll find that in the comments of this live as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, I always download these lives off of Facebook and post them up onto YouTube so that you can find them. Then definitely check out the description of the video. You'll find all the links that you need there. And of course, please do follow the page, subscribe on YouTube. So mix-ins. The first step is to understand that there's 4 or more, but there's 4 main ways to add your mix-ins to your dough. And the decision about which one is going to be the best one will start to be affected by the factors surrounding what your mix-ins are going to be and what you're trying to accomplish, right? So the 4 main ways that you can add your mix-in to your dough is to add them at the initial mix. So when you're throwing your flour, salt, starter, and water into your bowl, you can add your mix-ins then, and you can mix them right into the dough. The pros of this would be that, you're going to start to infuse that flavor right from the very beginning. You're not going to have to worry about trying to add them later. And of course, you're going to very likely see very good distribution of the mix-ins throughout the dough, right? So that's number 1. Number 2 is to add those mix-ins during the stretch and fold process. So some of the same pros as the mix-ins, you're probably going to see very good distribution of the mix-ins through the bread, but you're also going to sort of allow the dough to start fermenting the way you would normally expect it to do before you add those mix-ins. So you're starting to make it so that the factors of the mix-ins affect the bread later, because that's going to be our biggest issue with mix-ins, is how are they going to affect the dough and change the way the dough ends up baking towards the end. And if you understand basically how that works, then you can start to really successfully add mix-ins. And of course, even knowing all of this, years into it, you might still have some, that one's kind of okay, but not fantastic. The next way to add mix-ins is at the shaping phase. So when you're shaping your dough, right, you can spread your dough out on the counter and add your mix-ins then. You know, the downfall of this is that you're not going to see distribution through the dough that's quite as good as if you had added it during stretching and folding, but it's added later to the dough. So those mix-ins are probably going to have less effect on the dough, right? And then the last option, of course, is if we don't want to mess with our dough at all, we can just put these sort of mix-ins on top of or around the bread. So, you know, roll our dough in it after we've done our final shape, or even just put it on as a topping right before we bake. So how are we going to decide how to do those mix-ins? Well, if we understand the factors of our mix-ins and how they affect our dough, then we can start to make the decision as to what's the best way to add the mix-ins. So this is probably going to be my quickest everything I've learned about sourdough, because this is really super simple. If the mix-in that you're adding is either going to increase your hydration, decrease your hydration, or have little to no effect. And all you need to do is think about the mix-in that you're using and determine what it was. And then you also need to understand the sneaky mix-ins. So there's certain mix-ins that you might think are a solid that would decrease your hydration, but they actually act more like a liquid and increase your hydration. So what are we talking about with hydration? Hydration is the percentage of liquid, usually water if we're just doing classic sourdough, of flour that we're using for our bread. So if we're doing a 500 grams of flour, loaf of bread, and we're using 350 grams of water, that's 70% hydration, right? High hydration sourdough is between 75 and 100%. You can go all the way past 100% hydration. Lower hydration sourdough goes all the way down to 65%, right? The more hydration we have with the dough, the stickier it is, the harder it is to work with, but the airier it's going to be, the crispier and lighter, right? So when we find baguettes that have those huge holes in them, very crispy outside, light and fluffy on the inside, that's a very high hydration dough. When we find sourdoughs that are a little bit more dense and have that nice heavy feel, dip them in soup, make a grilled cheese with them, smaller holes, that's usually a lower hydration, assuming all things are equal and that they're being baked properly, right? Sourdough by nature is high hydration compared to normal bread. A lot of breads without a sourdough, right? Outside of sourdough, so your sandwich breads, that sort of thing, that hydration percentage tends to be a lot lower. If you're doing anything but sourdough, 70% is usually considered high hydration. This means that if we start adding things to our dough, it's going to affect the hydration significantly, right? A 10-gram difference in liquid, so going from 340 grams of water, which is 68%, to 350 grams of water, which is 70%, can make a huge difference on the final ending of your bread. And if you're a beginner, it's much easier to manage lower hydration. So the only question we need to ask with mix-ins, well, two questions we need to ask. Question one is, how is this mix-in going to affect my hydration? Is it going to increase it, decrease it, or have no effect? And then the second question is, based on knowing this, which style of adding this mix-in am I going to do? Am I going to add it at the mix, at the stretch and fold, at the shaping, or just put some on top? So things that you could add to your bread that would have little to no effect are things that won't burst open in the short period of time that your dough is fermenting, or that the seeds are, or that the things are sitting there and I just let it slip, right? Seeds, in most cases, will have little to no effect on your hydration, right? They're not going to absorb that much water in the short period of time that your sourdough is fermenting in, right? So you can add seeds at the very beginning when you mix them. You can add them at the end. You can put them on as a topping. They're going to have very little effect, right? And anything you can think of. So look at what it is that you're adding, right? Is this thing going to change its structure during the fermentation process, during the rise process, even during the baking process. So then what things are going to decrease our hydration? If we're adding dry spices, dried things like parsley, like oregano, like basil, like garlic powder, if we're wanting to add other sort of flours like almond flour or spelt or oat flour, right? These are going to decrease our hydration if we were just to add them without changing the water, right? So often with things that are going to decrease the hydration, what you can do is you can add those at the mix phase so that they're really well incorporated through the bread and just directly reduce the amount of flour that you're using by the amount of that item that you're using. So if you're trying to stay at a 70% hydration, for example, and you want to add 50 grams total of a blend of garlic powder, parsley, basil, maybe a little bit of spelt, then just simply reduce the amount of flour that you use by that amount. So 450 grams of flour, 50 grams. So if we're finding that the thing that we're going to add is going to reduce the hydration, then usually the best, or not the best, but you can just add it during the mix phase, and then you're going to know it's going to be really well spread out through the dough. That flavor is going to incorporate into the dough and last through. Now we have to start thinking about the items that increase our hydration, because increasing hydration with sourdough is almost always the thing that's going to have the most serious consequence, whether it's a good consequence or a bad consequence. If we change the height of hydration with our dough, then it's going to be a big deal, right? So we either need to reduce the amount of water that we're using or increase the amount of flour, or accept that we're operating on a different hydration percentage. And a lot of times with these mix-ins, we can't actually quantify it. We don't know how much moisture this thing is going to add to our bread. So that would make an argument for adding items that will increase our hydration later in the process, right? If we add them right when we shape them, then they're only going to have the time that it takes to cold proof to contribute to the hydration of that bread. But don't be fooled, they will still contribute. Or we could add them at the last second, right before we bake them, either by reshaping right before we bake or just putting them on as a topping. So sneaky things that are going to, whoa, who did that? I don't know who made that happen, but that was really cool. Somebody just made fireworks happen. I don't know who that was, but that was awesome. Or maybe I did it. Sometimes I do this thing like this and I get hearts happening within. So who knows? If I did that, if you know what I did, tell me in the comments. Maybe I can make that happen again, or someone did it to me. So obviously, if we're going to add maple syrup, or we're going to add honey, or we're going to add pineapple juice, or if we're going to add things like food coloring, liquid food coloring, obviously these things increase the hydration of the bread, and we can just directly reduce the amount of water that we're using by those things, right? We want 25 grams of pineapple juice. We're just going to reduce our water by 25 grams, right? So there's lots of different mix-ins you could do. And I would love it if you would go in the comments and list your favorite mix-ins so that I have a million ideas for different recipes. That would be so cool. Do that for me. I most often do cheese and jalapeno, and I often do add like basil and garlic and extra salt to my bread to make dipping into pastas and everything else. What are some of the sneaky things? Sugar. A lot of people would think that sugar is going to be one of those things that's going to contribute to our dry ingredients, right? If we're going to add 50 grams of sugar, then maybe we should reduce our flour. But it actually has the opposite effect. Sugar 100% of the time turns to a liquid as soon as you add liquid to it. It liquefies. So if you've ever made cinnamon buns before, right? If you've ever made any type of bread that's got sugar in it, you know that as soon as you heat that up, right? As soon as you add strawberries to a pan, right? And the sugars inside the strawberries start to come out, what you get is a liquid. So when you're adding sugar to your bread, you need to treat it like a wet ingredient, right? Is it Is it equal? I don't know. Is 50 grams of sugar equal to 50 grams of water? I don't actually know. I haven't tested it, but I would assume it probably is. Mass is mass, right? But if you're going to add sugar at the early stages, so say for example, you want a cinnamon sugar loaf where that cinnamon sugar is just really integrated into the dough, right? Then you are going to want to be careful about reducing your water if you're going to add it early in the process during the stretching and folding process. Say you're making a chocolate loaf, right? That cocoa is going to act like flour. So you can just reduce the amount of flour that you're using by the amount of cocoa that you're using to give it that deep chocolate. But you usually want to add sugar to a chocolate loaf, right? For that side of it, you're probably going to want to adjust your hydration. Another sneaky one, cheese, right? Cheese, we know what happens when we melt cheese. Liquid, right? Cheese acts like liquid. Another one that it happens across the board is fruits and vegetables, okay? But fruits and vegetables are going to be the hardest ones to quantify. If we add jalapeno to our loaf early in the phase, like say during the mix or the stretch and fold process, it's going to leach the liquid out of itself, right? That liquid that was contained within the vegetable is going to leach out of it into the dough and contribute to the hydration. But we don't know how much, right? So either we want to try to estimate how much and reduce our water by that much, or we want to say we accept that this is going to happen and treat this bread as if it was a higher hydration bread. So we still use our 70% water and we add our jalapenos and cheese during the stretch and fold phase. We want to act like this is an 80% hydration dough, right? Which means it's going to be a little bit trickier to shape. We're going to have to keep a closer eye on the bulk fermentation stage, all sorts of things when it comes to hydration. And I will very soon do an everything I learned about sourdough hydration and baker's math, because now that I'm standing here, I can see that. So if you want to follow along, this is my new series that I started for the new year. There is a playlist on Facebook called Everything I've Learned About Sourdough. And after I do these lives on Facebook, within a couple of days, I download them and add them to that playlist. So definitely follow along. So now we know, right? Now we know why we see people saying, how come I'm trying to do this mix-in? I make bread all the time and it's always perfect, right? I use the same recipe all the time, and it doesn't matter what the recipe is. It doesn't matter if it's 65 or 80% hydration. You're doing it all the time. It's always working for you. But every time you try to add these dang silly mix-ins, it's changing, right? So I'm just going to show you guys. A girlfriend of mine asked me to make her some rainbow bread, and I decided that instead of rainbow bread, I was going to make unicorn bread. So what did I add? I added food coloring, I added sugar, I added marshmallows, I added chocolate chips, and I added sprinkles to this. Catherine says, hey, still loving your videos. I'm so glad you're here. The only reason I make them is because people come watch. So thank you so much. So with this loaf, the sugar liquefied, the chocolate chips liquefied, the marshmallows liquefied, and the food coloring contributed to the hydration, and my sprinkles also liquefied because they're purely sugar based. So it's hard to kind of see this. I've got a little light happening here to try and show you. But as you can see, in a little while, maybe later today or tomorrow, I'm actually going to post some photos of the process of making this loaf. It looked much more beautiful than this. And my sprinkles that I had put in there did not spread through the dough as beautifully as I would have liked it. So what happened with this? Well, by the time I went to shape it, so as you can see, it's got a fairly good ear happening here, but I kind of had to force that ear. By the time I went to shape this dough, so I mixed my dough, I slightly increased the flour. I increased the flour by about 10 grams, and I reduced my water by about 20 grams, and I think I really needed to do a lot more than that. I added about 20 grams of sugar, and I added my food coloring at the same time that I added all of my ingredients. So I have my stand mixer, so I use the Bosch Universal Plus stand mixer. When I mix all of my doughs, it works fantastic. If you don't have one and you want one, Nutrimill.com, the coupon code sourdough for beginners always gets you $20 off at checkout. You can use that a million times. If you want to learn about stand mixers, we've got a stand mixer sourdough playlist. That's a whole other thing. But I've got my stand mixer going, and I've got my regular ingredients, flour, salt, water, starter, and I added a bunch of purple and red food coloring in until I got the color that I wanted, and at the same time I added the sugar. And then I stretched and folded this dough, and then when it came time to shape it, that's when I spread chocolate chips, marshmallows, and sprinkles out. So I stretched the dough out as thin as I could, made it as big as I could, added these things, and then shaped the bread, and then cold proofed them. Well, at that point, when I was adding them, I had already given up on the bread. It was way too sticky. The hydration was way too high. There was nothing I could do to save the dough. So what I did was I shaped it anyway. I put it in my Banneton. I stuck it in the freezer overnight, and then I baked it the next day from frozen. And that's a whole other thing. If anybody wants to learn about how to freeze dough and bake it from frozen, let me know in the comments and I will work on that one. But if not, we won't focus on it. So what happened? I ended up with dough that is edible, but it's quite dense. It's quite heavy. I did get an ear on the bread. But I had to force that ear, which means that when I first started baking the dough, the ear sort of fused. So if you look here, this is the first cut that I made in the dough down here, and you can see that it did start to open up. But what happened was it cooked close before any of the carbon monoxide inside of the dough could escape. So I cut it again, so you can see my second cut here, and that allowed it to spring a little bit and prevented it from becoming a brick, but it's still quite heavy. And as you can see some of the sprinkles in there, but they actually dissolved, right? They actually just melded into the dough. So what I've learned with sprinkles, they become a wet ingredient, and I would only ever add them at the last minute before baking. So if I want to make a sprinkle based loaf, what I'm thinking is that I'm going to shape the dough right before baking, even if that means just cold proofing it and then reshaping it, which we usually don't do. Maybe just let it rise for another hour on the counter. I'm going to continue to experiment with this. If you look here, and it's kind of a little tricky to see, but right here, it's very sticky looking, right? That's the sugar that I put in. And that is obviously a liquid. It started to solidify again, but you can see that bubbled out of the bread like a liquid. So I hope this has helped you. Right? You can add any mix-ins that you want to your bread, and you're going to have tons of success. Of course, you can do it by trial and error, and everything with sourdough is always going to be trial and error, right? Sourdough is affected by the temperature. It's affected by your mood, probably. Who knows? We all know how finicky sourdough can be. But if you know these basics, right? The 4 ways to add your mix-ins. So either when you're mixing your dough at the stretch and fold phase, when you're shaping your dough, or as a topping, right? And then the factors that affect your hydration. Is this a dry ingredient? Is this a wet ingredient? Or is this an ingredient that has no effect? And once we know if it's an ingredient that's dry or wet, how much so, right? Jalapenos, how much liquid are they going to let out into the bread? And once we understand these things, then we can adjust the hydration of our bread and go for it, right? And then even someone like me who's been making sourdough forever might end up with a loaf that goes, that didn't quite work, so now I have to keep practicing. So definitely on the Facebook page in the next little while, I will post about how I made this dough and what I'm going to change about it. And I appreciate you all being here and following along. Tell me in the comments with your sourdough journey, what things do you want covered in the Everything I've Learned About Sourdough series? We'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.